Hi there and welcome to another video. This is Jennifer McGuire and I hope you're having a good week. Today I am really excited to share with you a fun technique using some fun new products. The technique is layered heat embossed backgrounds. Recently I showed how to create a heat embossed background with die cutting and I'll link to that video here. But in this video I'm going to focus on creating layered heat embossed backgrounds with stamps and stencils. The result is really unique. You get this glossy finish and lots of texture, and I'm just crazy about it. So I have a bunch of examples for you today. Now, all of the examples use new products from Simon Says Stamp. I thought this was a great way to show you some of their new products. Now, Simon Says Stamp is launching their Stamptember month. This is a month-long celebration of stamping where they have new products and giveaways and lots of fun things going on. So be sure to check it out. I don't work for Simon Says Stamp, but I work with them a lot because I really like the people that are there. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive into the techniques for today. I'm first going to show you how to create layered heat embossed backgrounds with your stamps. This is a great way to get more out of your stamps and your embossing powders, which happen to be very inexpensive. So let's start with this example here. It's very bold. I have a piece of 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch kind of pool colored cardstock, and I'm covering the front of it with Versamark ink so that it has clear sticky ink all over it. And then I'm sprinkling on this beautiful turquoise colored embossing powder. I'm making sure to cover all of the open areas so that there is embossing powder over the entire cardstock piece. I then put it on a cutting board and get my heat gun really good and hot and then start heat embossing. And you can see the surface becomes textured and shine. Now you could leave it there, but I like to do 2 layers of embossing powder. That helps to give you even more of a glossy finish and it creates less texture. So it's got a little texture, but it's a bit smoother, and I really like that result better. So I'm just repeating the process. Now it may seem that you're using a lot of embossing powder, but really a little goes a long way, and I guarantee it doesn't use too much. This bottle of embossing powder will last you for a long time. So there we have our heat embossed covered cardstock. So now I'm going to use my MISTI. You do not have to use your MISTI for this, but I just decided to use it with this new Simon Says Stamp Kaleidoscope Leaves background stamp. This is a beautiful stamp. I took the black foam out of my MISTI since I'm using a cling stamp with it, and I'm just temporarily adhering my glossy heat embossed paper into the MISTI, and I'm inking up my stamp with Versamark ink. Now this is very important. You want to use an anti-static powder tool over that heat embossed finish before you stamp on it, just so you get a clean stamped heat embossed image. So now I've stamped Versamark ink on top of that heat embossed background, and I'm adding some Wendy Vecchi leaf green embossing powder on top of that. So we're gonna have green on top of that teal color. Now I'm going to go ahead and heat set this, and you can see when the green embossing powder melts, it melts into the teal colored embossing powder, creating a beautiful, smooth, continuous finish with a little bit of texture. And you can see when it has melted. So there's no guessing game here. Just keep your heat gun moving so you don't overheat it, but really you should have no problem. And check out that beautiful shine and texture that you get with this technique. It's so gorgeous. Now before we pull this together into a card, I want to show you a bunch of different layered heat embossed backgrounds. So we'll come back to creating the card at the end of this video. My next example is the one you see here, and I really think this technique of layered heat embossed backgrounds is effective, or most effective, with metallic embossing powders. Silver embossing powder is one that I think every crafter should have. I like Hero Art's silver embossing powder, but any should work for this. I covered a piece of cardstock with Versamark ink. You can use any color cardstock, by the way, because it will be hidden. And then I added my silver embossing powder. Next, I'm going to put it on a cutting board and heat set it. You can see very easily when the powder has melted. It gets that beautiful shine. Now with 1 layer of heat embossing, you see that shine with the bit of texture that you get. Since you're kind of stretching embossing powder over a whole background, it's going to not be so smooth. That's why once it's cool, I press my Versamark ink pad on it again and add that 2nd layer of embossing powder. Now the results from this one will be much smoother. So it's a nice thing to do to add that 2nd layer, but you can skip it if you wanted to. So now we're going to heat emboss on top of this heat embossing. So I'm putting that heat emboss piece into my MISTI, and we're going to stamp on top of it with the Simon Says Stamp Good Reading background stamp. This has like a distressed vintage textbook look to it. It's really quite beautiful. Definitely using my anti-static powder tool first, and then we'll stamp that background on there with Versamark ink. Any clear embossing ink should work for this. I've just used Versamark for so many years that that's the one I always reach for. And by the way, using your Versamark ink pad a lot is okay. So, smearing that on the background of your paper is fine. Re-inkers are available, but I find that my Versamark ink pad lasts quite a while, and I just replace it when it gets really dirty. Okay, so on top of this, I'm adding Wow Verdigris embossing powder. Wow and Ranger both have this type of embossing powder, and both are beautiful. And it's kind of like a pool-colored embossing powder with some metallics thrown in. So it gives a really gorgeous look. And when you heat set it, that silver kind of wraps around the text that's heat embossed on there and gives a beautiful textured look that is just gorgeous. So there is another example of layering heat embossing powders. You can layer metallics with non-metallics, with mixes, with glitter embossing powder, anything you want. The sky is the limit. Embossing powders are very inexpensive, so this is a great way to get more out of any that you may have. Okay, so my next example here, this might be one of my favorites. It uses this really cool Simon Says Stamp Ornate background stamp. This one I could imagine stamping with black ink and coloring in with lots of colors, but today we're going to just stamp on it for this layered technique. I have a piece of white cardstock in there that's covered with 2 layers of silver embossing. I just skipped that step here for you, just like I did earlier. Stamping this with Versamark ink, and this time I'm going to add a few different colors of embossing powder. I'm going to kind of do a blended look from the top to the bottom. So first I put down green embossing powder, and then at the end of the section of green, I sprinkle on a light amount. Then I put the turquoise on top of that. And then again, sprinkle a little bit when it's going to transition to the next color. And then pour blue on top of that. By doing that sprinkle of color in between each transition, it helps to blend between the 2 colors. Now watch closely as I apply heat to this. You can see the colored embossing powder almost like melts into that silver heat embossed background. And what results kind of looks like an embossed metal with color on it. So it's a really cool technique, and I've never been able to achieve a look like this before, so this is really fun. Now, so far I've shown you several examples of using a background stamp to create, these layered backgrounds, but I wanted to show you can use this technique for any stamp. So for this example, I started with a piece of cardstock with 2 layers of gold embossing powder on it. And then I'm going to stamp a leaf from this new Simon Says Stamp set right on top of those 2 layers of gold embossing powder. Always make sure that everything has cooled before you add the next layer. Now onto this, I'm going to sprinkle a few different colors of embossing powder. Notice that I'm not wasting much because I'm only sprinkling a little bit with my fingers. So I did a brown and orange and then a little bit of green towards the tip. And then I can knock off the excess powder and heat set it. And you'll see that those colors kind of sink into the gold background and you get a really cool result. So you can look at any stamps that you have and do this technique. In fact, I did it with the sentiment too. This is a thanks sentiment from Simon Says Stamp. I stamped it with Versamark ink, added some of that brown embossing powder, and it works great on that heat embossed background. So there is an example of doing this heat embossed layering with regular stamps too. Now, you know me, I love to stretch my supplies as much as possible, so I thought I'd show you this technique using stencils too. So you can do layered heat embossing with your stencils, and I think this is probably the coolest of all the different layered heat embossing techniques. Okay, so I have a piece of cardstock here with 2 layers of silver embossing on it. I'm using a beautiful new stencil from Simon Says Stamp. This is so intricate and so detailed. This is the Simon Says Stamp stained glass stencil. And I'm just going to use tape to hold it down over my heat embossed background. And I was sure to use my anti-static powder tool before I did this. Now I'm just pressing my Versamark ink pad directly over the stencil, and then I'll remove the stencil and add my embossing powder. So notice that there is a lot of open area on the stencil. So whatever embossing powder I put on top is actually going to cover most of that silver embossing powder background. So it will actually look like we have this wire looking silver pattern against a blue background. So here I'm going to go ahead and heat set this. Now just keep your heat gun moving. As soon as it melts, keep moving on to the next area. You don't want to overheat an area or that blue will kind of melt into the silver and they'll mix up. But I'll be honest, I did all of these backgrounds and I never had a problem with it mixing up. So you should be fine. Okay, so there is one example of creating a layered heat embossed background with stencils. Such a gorgeous look. I wanted to show you a few more examples. This one is silver and gold together. I know not many people have a bunch of colors of embossing powder, so I wanted to show you that if you have silver and gold, you can use those together. Again, I'm starting out with a background that has 2 layers of silver heat embossing, and I'm putting a Simon Says Stamp Holiday Tree Medallion stencil on top. This is another very intricate one. I'm using my anti-static powder tool and pressing Versamark ink over it. By the way, I have 2 different anti-static powder tools. Both work great. I've been using the little bag lately because I like the smell of the powder in that better. Actually, I like the lack of smell in it better. Lost it for a few days, had to order a new one, and so that's why you see me switch halfway through the video. Okay, so on top of that, I put gold embossing powder from Hero Arts. And here you can see the results when I add the heat to it. That gold melts onto that silver and they become really smooth and just absolutely beautiful. It looks like a faux metal, and this would be a great background for a holiday card. So I definitely will be doing that in the future. I have one more stencil example for you. This is using a mini stencil. It's a 3x3 stencil from Simon Says Stamp. I heat embossed a smaller piece of cardstock with 2 layers of silver embossing powder. And now I'm going to press Versamark ink over that opening and add that verdigris embossing powder that I showed you earlier. And with this example, you can get a better appreciation for the mix of powders that are together in this one verdigris powder. It gives the most beautiful look against that silver background. So if you don't have like a big stencil or any stencils, you can create your own by either die cutting or punching a shape and using that as a stencil or mask. Okay, so now that we've created a bunch of pieces here, let's start making some cards. I'm going to start by showing you how I made this card here in the middle, and I'll show you all the cards at the end of the video. I started by trimming off a little bit from the sides of our heat embossed background, so I end up with a piece that is 4 by 5 1/4. Now I temporarily taped a heart die there so I could cut a little window in the front of the panel, and I can save that extra heat embossed heart for another project. Now I wanted to kind of build my own sentiment, and I used 2 stamp sets. This is the Simon Says Stamp Live Well stamp set. I like those bold greetings there. And I teamed it up with the new Simon Says Stamp You Got This stamp set. This has a lot of encouraging sentiments, so I will definitely use these. This is great for the inside of cards too. Now on that heart, I'm going to have an acetate window, and I want to heat emboss the word hello on it. Because I'm going to heat emboss on the acetate, I need to use heat resistant acetate. I like this one from Hot Off the Press. All you do is cut out a piece that you need and use anti-static powder tool on it. Then you can stamp your sentiment with Versamark ink. You just want to be careful to press firmly but not move because you don't want to smear it. And then add your silver embossing powder. Now when you put the powder on, it's going to want to stick to the acetate. Just flick it very firmly, and that will knock off all the excess powder, and you can heat set it and get a nice crisp image. So we need to glue this piece of acetate so it shows through that window. So I'm flipping my panel over, putting adhesive around the heart opening, and laying our acetate right on it, making sure to center our word hello. Now I want this to kind of raise up off the front of the card. So I'm going to put some double-sided foam tape on the back of it. And notice I'm very generous. That's because I want this to hold up when I go through the mail. And I'm adding that to a top folding 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch white note card. I like that heat embossed sentiment that says hello kind of creates a shadow on the white below it since it's raised up. And I also added a little sentiment strip with the You Make Life Beautiful sentiment, and that is from the Simon Says stamp You Got This stamp set that I showed you earlier. I also added a little heart die cut and covered it with glossy accents. I thought that little pop of red was fun. Now, most of the cards I created have this design that I just showed you, but I did do one card that's a little bit different, and I have a tip I want to share with you. It's a card that you see here that has the Together die cuts. I used this new Simon Says stamp Together die and the new Simon Says stamp Together stamp set. There are lots of encouraging stamp sentiments in here about how we can do better together, and I'm really using that set a lot. Now for this one, I put it together just like the last one. I heat embossed a small sentiment from that Together stamp set right onto that acetate. And I also created some little Together layered die cuts. So I die cut that Together die from 4 pieces of white cardstock and 1 piece of blue cardstock. And I glued each of the letters together so they were stacked nicely, and that just gives it some fun dimension. Now, to make sure that I adhere each of these letters down so they're evenly spaced, I used my negative space. I temporarily taped it onto my card exactly where I want my sentiment to be. And now I can put adhesive on the back of each of my stacked letters and glue them right into the opening. Once I have all my letters down, I can remove that negative space, and I have my letters perfectly spaced and perfectly centered. Using your negative space is a great way to line up individual die cuts like that. Okay, so now that I've shown you the basic card design, I wanted to show you all the examples that I made today. You can also see photos of these cards over my blog. Here's the first background I made with the green embossing layered on top of the blue. I did the heat embossing of the hello right onto the acetate and a small sentiment strip right below that. For the second card, this is the one that has the verdigris on the silver. I used that specialty embossing powder for the word hugs, and you can see how beautiful that is on the acetate. And I always put a little red heart with some glossy accents. I think that little pop of red is very fun. Now this one is really unique. I did 2 layers of white embossing powder first. Then I used the ornate background stamp to heat emboss a purplish pink embossing powder on top of that. I really like the look of that white underneath it because it gives a really gorgeous glossy finish. So you can use your white powders with any colored powders. Now that stacked hello die cut covered with silver embossing powder is the Simon Says stamp painted hello die cut. And the little sentiment strip, that's also from the Simon Says stamp You Got This stamp set. Now here's the background where I did gold embossing on top of silver using a stencil. And again, I did a little pop of red with the heart. And then here is the Together die cut one that I just showed you. I put glossy accents on top of the Together die cuts just to give them lots of shine. And again, the little red heart with glossy accents too. Now this example is pretty crazy here. I did a blue embossing powder on top of a pinkish purple, and it really is cool in real life. Now I also did that pinkish purple embossing powder on the window, so you can use colored embossing on your acetate also. Now remember, with this card design, we have lots of hearts left over with the cool layered embossing, so we can use those on a future card. Kind of ran out of time today, but I'll definitely use them in the future. These backgrounds were a lot of fun to create. I hope you give this technique a try. Go to my blog for a photo of all of these cards along with the supplies used, or you can find the supplies linked below in my YouTube description. You can also go to my blog to find more information about Simon Says Stamp's Stamptember celebration and some fun giveaways. In the middle are 2 other videos worth checking out, including that first one there that shows heat embossing with die cutting for fun backgrounds. I appreciate you spending some time with me today, and to those of you in Texas, please know that you're in my prayers. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon.